started, so feel free. Yes, we are going to be recording. Thank you for doing that. Feel free to introduce yourself however you'd like. In the chat, your name, if you'd like to share your gender pronoun and what brought you here today. And so just a couple of things before we get started. We looks like we do have our chat open, so please feel free throughout the webinar to put any questions, any thoughts in there. And if you want to unmute and ask a question, you're also welcome to do that. Obviously, we will be checking it for any Zoom bombing that has happened to us in the past a few times. But again, we want this to be an exchange. We want, we are going to be having discussion part, conversation part. So definitely want folks to be able to feel free to express. So, so as we're talking, feel free to go ahead and do that. And so today we'll be basically looking at a couple of things. We'll be looking at, with a lot of the school shootings, the mass shootings, this talk around gun control, right? How does that fit in into abolition? How does that fit into the war on youth? How do we address these things, without looking to the state, without state criminalization, knowing that the state itself is and has been the problem. So we'll be starting with that. We'll be looking at some updates on City Hall with some of the programs and policies we've been fighting and building our fight against. And then we are going to go into talking about community policing and counterinsurgency and how those are really being pushed. They've been being pushed, but how they're being pushed at a much larger level now, right, with the increase with gun violence and the shootings, and so and white supremacy, which we know has always been there, but of course now that the state is supposedly naming it, we see this push for some programs really rooted in these anti-terrorism, anti-violent extremism measures. So that's really one of the things we look at and we fight against with the war on youth, is how really youth have been criminalized through various narratives, right? We know the gang narrative is one that's been for decades used to criminalize Black youth, brown youth, immigrant youth, Native youth. And now we see this push, we've been seeing a push now in that transition and connection to targeting and criminalizing youth as threats to national security, as potential violent extremists. And so that's really kind of a very brief summary of our fight. Some of the programs we are looking at, one is called Countering Violent Extremism, which was started by the Department of Homeland Security. And on a more local level, they have what's called TVTP, right? A lot of acronyms. So targeted violence and terrorism prevention is what they're calling it. And recently LA did pass a grant, right, to go towards LAPD's program, that is particularly looking at anti-violent extremism measures called PATHE, providing alternatives to hinder extremism, right? So of course, co-opting and using our language, but really what that program is doing is it's creating teams of informants looking to teachers, students, faith leaders, counselors, social workers, to essentially report on youth for behaviors they deem to be suspicious, right? Some of these behaviors that the FBI has named suspicious are things such as being too much into your culture, expressing anger or frustration, being a migrant, being in poverty, feeling isolated, right? So a lot of things that are really core to being a youth, right? And so so we know these programs historically and continue to target Black and brown and Muslim and immigrant and indigenous and trans youth. And so I'll go ahead and pause there. And want to go ahead and introduce Akil and Adami, if y'all would want to introduce yourselves. We're going to be going into and talking about now gun violence and shootings and having some question and answers around that. So if you two would like to introduce yourselves, go for it.
Hi everyone, I'm Akil. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm with Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. And together with Nadia, we're really happy to be interviewing and giving some questions to Dami to provide everybody with really great insights on this topic. So Dami, would you like to introduce yourself next?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Dami. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a lawyer. I do mostly civil rights litigation, and I'm based in LA.
Awesome.
Nice, thank you.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Go for it, Akil. Yeah, get us started.
Okay, let me pull up the first question. Sorry, you all. So,
No worries. Oh.
so Dami, could you talk first a little bit? You know, we are in the state of California, which has some of the most stringent gun control in the country, but the roots of that may not be known by a lot of people. Probably a good number of people on this call know about it, but could you talk about the racist roots of gun control in California and how that came about?
Yeah, I always like think about the roots of gun control in California, and I think this is true, but it's also kind of like a mythical story about like the Black Panthers and how gun control came up in California. And I think Bloom's book, I forget his first name, but their book on the Black Panthers like really details this well. Like everyone knows, in the '60s, the Black Panthers Party, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, came up in California, started in Oakland, and they were very militant and they carried guns on the street. And that was completely legal. It was completely legal to carry a loaded rifle on the street without a license. It was just legal and part of your rights, or at least there were no regulations or law limiting your ability to do so. And then, you know, obviously that terrifies everyone. There's all these stories about the cops pulling the Panthers over and, you know, seeing a bunch of guns in the car and saying, you guys can't have this. And they're like, yeah, it's well within our rights to have these guns. Shortly after the Black Panther Party starts, you know, in the early '60s, you have California like passing a gun control bill, the first, you know, real hardcore stringent gun control bill in, I think, the late '60s, '67, '68. And this comes, you know, months or within a year after the Panther Party goes to the state capitol, you know, with their rifle, and everyone has seen the pictures of them, you know, inside the assembly hall with their rifles, which was perfectly legal at that time. And the funny thing about the story is the NRA, you know, which we know as the, you know, the fantastical gun nuts now, were even pro-gun control then, because like everyone saw them as a threat, and Black people with guns has always and forever will be a threat in this country. And that's not only the roots of like gun control in California, but the roots of gun control nationwide. I mean, I think the other story that everyone kind of knows is that, you know, gun control, you know, comes from, you know, the slave codes, which says Black folks can't have guns, to the Black codes post, post Civil War saying Black folks can't have guns, and then to like all these kinds of legislations that come after and are trying to like, you know, do end runs around, you know, the Civil Rights Amendment and the 14th Amendment to ensure Black folks don't have guns. And I think something we will get into later is, you know, this kind of counterinsurgency idea is that like even the Supreme Court in passing this gun control, I mean, not passing, but in issuing this order that, you know, has kind of said that you have to be lax with gun laws, or that kind of really, you know, reinforces the Second Amendment, this reactionary and racist Supreme Court, like even mentioned in the argument that like, hey, isn't like gun control kind of racist in its origin? And, you know, that, you know, always kinds of gives me pause as to like how to think and address things. But like, you know, even I guess a blind dog gets a bone every once in a while. But it is just so clear that gun control is steeped in and has a racial past that even like the reactionary Supreme Court sees and accepts that.
Really quickly before the next question, I just wanted to connect that to the fights that this campaign focuses on. One of the most important cases of people targeted under the framework of Black identity extremism was this activist named Rakem Balogun, who was when he was arrested, and it was primarily for anti-police Facebook posts. He was also part of two groups, including one that was called the Huey P. Newton Huey P. Newton, of course, of the Black Panthers, and advocating for the rights of Black gun owners. And he was doing not only self-defense classes, but also, coordinating meals for homeless, according to The Guardian. So youth picnics, basically care work in the community, and part of care work in his analysis, and I think in many people's, is self-defense, especially under the assault of state terror. So it really, that perpetual fear is then recycled under the framework of these anti-extremism programs, particularly targeting Black gun owners. Nadia, sorry, I just wanted to throw that connection in there.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And one thing too, I put in the chat was how within the Black Identity Extremism program, of course, the name has been changed, but the practice and the targeting of Black youth hasn't. But really under that program, it was looking at how it basically said how Black youth perceived police violence against them. And because of that perception, would be more prone to becoming, violent extremists. So yeah, I just wanted to name that. Thank you for bringing up that connection, Akil. Yeah, and again, as a reminder, like Mattia said, feel free to put any questions in the chat as they come up for you. The next question I wanted to talk about was the recent Supreme Court decision. If you could talk, Dami, a little bit about that, and in regards to the gun control Supreme Court decision and what its impacts have been.
Yeah. I remember, like, I don't know how closely people follow this, but some of my friends who are public defenders in New York wrote, or one of my friends at least, was part of this brief about how gun laws are so racist, and then they filed that in the Supreme Court. And at that point I had no real idea what the case was about. I was like, oh, this is just very cool. Yeah, gun laws are racist. We know the people who get punished for carrying guns are like Black folks and brown folks. All the cases that go to the criminal courts about gun possession are about Black folks carrying guns. But the case is really not remarkable at all if you read it. Most of the states, and I think the case said about like 43 of the states, I mean, all the states say you need a license to carry a gun. Most states just give you a license by just, you just basically check a box and say, like, I want it for self-defense, or you don't provide a reason. But New York says that, like, oh, you have to have a reason beyond self-defense. And California's law said the same thing, beyond just self-defense. And like, you may have to go sit for an interview or whatever. And the Supreme Court struck that down. Now, I just, but what the Supreme Court didn't strike down is that you need a license to carry guns, that, like, if you've been convicted of a felony, you can't carry a gun. And if you're convicted of a felony and there are laws in your state that punish you for carrying a gun, serious laws, 15, 20 years in prison, those laws are all okay under the Supreme Court's case. And so I'm always somewhat suspicious, when people put the, like, hey, like, this is a racial justice victory, because it's not. I'm not sure how many people, in the Bronx where this, this amicus brief from the public defenders come from, how many people who are there who go through Bronx criminal court and are charged with unlawful carrying a weapon, like, sought a permit or a license and was denied, and that's why they weren't carrying a weapon without a permit. Like, I don't know if, like, it doesn't strike me as though, like, that is the case, and that's, like, really, we really have a win, like, if we're not, if we're trying to abolish and limit, like, the state's ability to punish people. I don't know whether this case does that and whether it's something to be very happy about. But generally, like, the case says, like, yeah, if you're a state, all the laws can stay on the books as it relates to, like, criminalizing gun ownership and gun possession. But, like, if someone goes with a clean record in the court, like, they make sure, like, they keep saying, like, ordinary upstanding citizens who have a clean record, if they want to, if they want a gun and they go and they seek a license, you can't force them to proffer a reason beyond wanting it for self-defense or some other banal reason before giving them a license. But I just, that was the law in the majority of the states anyway. And so I just don't see this case as being incredibly important And I think what we'll get to later is kind of like, you know, the hysteria, you know, I guess we can disagree or whether it's rightful or wrongful about people in large cities like New York and LA saying that, oh my God, now so many more people will have guns on the subway and that could lead to a bunch of different things. But, you know, I will put that aside for now.
So one thing that it's seeming like is that both the effort to distribute or get guns to the people the state wants to have guns or take the guns away from people, it's both the lack of gun control and gun control gets weaponized against Black communities. It seems like from the way that you're talking, and one of the ways that it seems like it happens is that the laws basically, I mean, if you think about what you were talking about around having not who doesn't have a record, who are the people that the police get into the system from when they're children, you know, and who are the people who then get implicitly trusted when they go to try to get that gun and don't have to claim self-defense. So it you know, definitely seems like it's a push and pull. And one of the things that we were talking about is the fact that there's this simultaneous culture of on kind of on the cultural right, this celebration of guns, and then I don't want to call it the left, but in liberal spaces, this sort of demonization, especially of armed or violent resistance to oppression, whether it's in the US or in other places. So basically, how do we have an analysis and approach this topic without falling into either pit, you know? One of the things that Nadia and I were talking about before this call is it's not just, you know, people within the US, but there's this, for everywhere in the world, it seems, except for Ukraine, people are like, they need to, you know, protest peacefully. They need to, there's this phrase that, you know, it's really racist phrase of like, where's the Palestinian Gandhi? You know, like there's this, Gandhi supposedly even thought Jews should protest their annihilation during the Holocaust peacefully. You know, it's absurd shit. And I'm just kind of like wondering how we, so Dami, how do you approach this topic without either falling into the celebration, the zealotry around guns, or the absurd like policing of people, the way people resist?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think that's the question. I think it's a difficult question. I think you hit a good point in so far, and I think Hamid was making his point before everyone else got on the call is, and I think what I hear you saying is like, you know, under either law, this, you know, under the New York state law as it existed before the Supreme Court decision and now, like, you know, the white folks were gonna get guns anyway, right? Like, you know, they're not the ones with like, you know, the felony records who are hindering them or like keeping them from getting guns. You know, they're the ones who can go into police interviews and proffer some reason or justification of being afraid, you know, for some, you know, for whatever, and the police will believe them, or whoever is conducting the interview will believe them, and they'll give them the gun. So they were going to have the guns anyway. You know, and a lot of these mass shootings we're seeing, like these kids are getting guns, like they have licenses at 18. They don't have a criminal record and they have licenses. So when you said that, that like really just triggered that point to me is like, you know, so, you know, at least the hysteria around, you know, this decision doesn't really make sense to me because, you know, in the under the previous regime in New York, folks were going to get guns anyway. And the law was just really keeping like Black folks from getting guns. But this law doesn't really even expand that right that much for Black folks or people who have been formerly incarcerated or over policed or whatever. I mean, I think the bigger point or the bigger, you know, the bigger point or the bigger question that you're raising is this, you know, like really difficult one. Like it's also equally obvious to me that like the prospect of Black folks having guns is like deeply scary and frightening to white folks in America, and that you know, that is the history and origins of gun control, as we talked about. But there's also this other idea that is almost kind of not even about like Black folks, but it just becomes like the precarity of like the white middle class or like white folks in America generally. And that's kind of what, at least since that Las Vegas shooting, I had always like, now I think about when I think about, you know, the gun control debate. And what I mean by that is that, you know, there's all kinds of precarity in like American life, especially for poor folks and Black folks and brown folks and people of color or whatever. But like, you know, in a material sense, and so far as like you don't know whether you're going to eat, you don't know if you're going to keep your job or whatever. And like, you know, that same kind of material precarity, or whether you're going to be killed by the police. But that same kind of material precarity doesn't exist for like, you know, middle class white folks generally, especially in like, you know, really nice places in America. And so, you know, and and I was just thinking, just kind of from like this materialist conception, then like you have this thing where, you know, where like at people, and I always wonder, do people really think they're going to be like the victim of like a real mass shooting, like where more than, you know, I think the definition is 3 people will die, and we have a bunch of those, but like some really random like shooting as we had in Santa Fe, like 10 people get killed in the school, or, you know, in Las Vegas or in Chicago over, like those things are still so incredibly rare. But like, you know, the average middle class American still feels like they are like a target of those things, and like that they are precarious. And I think like that idea of whose precarity and what we recognize as like triggering hysteria and like laws being passed and, you know, mass movements being formed, like, you know, in the population at large, it is really disconcerting for me. Because like, yeah, maybe in 2020 or once in a while, when like a Black person gets killed by the cops, we start like as a society to understand the precarity of Black people, and it like actually means something to folks, and folks actually like want to do something about it. But of course the limit to that is like that their, you know, is their precarity. And so then that's why you have this reactionary pro-police like mass incarceration movement after you have some semblance of like decarceration and like abolition taking hold in like post like George Floyd uprising. But like the precarity that always exists and stays and like really like has purchase in America is when white folks really feel like their lives are a threat. And no matter how like actually abstract it is, and like how like unlikely it will happen to them, if like a bunch of like white people feel like something is a problem and a threat, like laws will be passed around it, and like people will be motivated, and legislatures and governors and corporations and everyone will get around the issue. And it's just not the same for everyone. I think that's kind of just a tangent. It doesn't really answer your question, Akil. So you can ask another like more direct question, or let me know if that like, you know, if that.
I think I have a way to clarify my question, especially to get at your legal scholarness. So you're a civil rights lawyer, and I'm just thinking about this like idea of, you know, connecting like gun control with civil liberties, and like specifically something like free speech,
Mm.
right? Where if you think about free speech as a concept, and then kind of connect it with power, it's like the people who are granted it's like the right to free speech always had that right, and then the people who are censored, it's like both the weaponization of it to give people the right or to take the right away is influenced by power, right? um so it's almost like it doesn't exist. It's just a marketplace of speech. It's like people who have speech as a commodity and people who don't have speech. And it seems like the kind of the same thing with guns, where the laws either take guns away from the people that the state doesn't want to have guns, or the lack of laws allow people to get guns that the state wanted to have guns. So in that context, as a lawyer, what do you think is the role, if any, of these kinds of like basically regulations done by a state that has an intent to cause harm? Like, do you think it's worth it for people to push for, protect certain kind of legal regulations, or do you think we should just think of everything through the lens of power and not even bother ourselves with these kinds of rules?
Oh, I got you. I got you. I mean, I think you've answered your question. Like everything has to be thought or view through the lens of power. I've always kind of understood like rights to just be purely discursive. Like they're just things that people say exist and that do exist for some people, but don't exist for a lot of people. I mean, I think, and the best example of that I always give or I always thought about in law school was, you know, you have a criminal procedure revolution in the 1960s and 70s that gives people a bunch of rights in criminal cases. You have a right to a lawyer, you have a right to remain silent, you know, if you can't be unlawfully interrogated, all these rights are given to folks that didn't exist before that, although, you know, some states gave them rights, but didn't exist as a federal constitutional right until then. And between 1960 and 2020, you know, the incarceration levels and the number of people incarcerated has gone up 20, 30, 50-fold, right? Like you don't have mass incarceration until after you have this imposition of a rights regime that's supposed to protect people from being incarcerated. And so you can only look at that and say like, the right doesn't mean anything. And so like, you know, the people that want rights are the people that have power because it protects them and allows them to do whatever the fuck they want. But like, you know, the state is way too clever to ever, you know, like, you know, you don't even have to be clever. You can see that like in the abortion context, you know, before last month, abortion basically wasn't legal in most of the country, although you had a right to abortion as per Roe v. Wade in 1973. And so it's like, you know, all you have is like, you know, the state and governments and whoever wants to like curtail your rights of the powerless are going to do it irrespective of whether the rights are on the table. And I think that's kind of what you were saying. I just think that's, you know, I can't even, you know, maybe if I thought really hard of like a right that couldn't, that was so fundamental that couldn't be abridged or curtailed, like, I don't think I can think of one. You know, the First Amendment right, the Fourth Amendment right to search and seizure, there's every right like that exists on the books and that's supposed to be kind of like absolute and like foundational right is not really foundational. This is, I'm not even, I'll stop there because there was another tangent coming.
No, go for it. Go for it.
No, this is also this is a really stupid tangent, but you know, the what is it called, this like when people are cancel culture, like the stuff about cancel culture is to be like maybe very tangential, maybe not the same and a little bit disanalogous, but it's the same thing, right? Like, you know, this idea of, you know, the one thing that I think is cool about cancel culture and the hysteria about people on Twitter being able to cancel people is just this kind of like real fear, you know, from the perspective of people with power that like, you know, they are, you know, that normal people can abridge what they deem is their right to freedom, you know, to freedom of speech, to free speech that normal people don't normally have. So like, I've always understood that to be like, if you're famous and powerful, you actually have a real right to speech. Like you can say whatever the fuck you want with impunity. But like, you know, for normal people, like that's not the case because your right to free speech could be abridged by your boss who doesn't like what you're saying, or by the state, or by the police officer who doesn't like what you're saying or whatever. But like, this was the kind of like one context I saw like, oh, the rights that don't really exist for people, and obviously there's no First Amendment right to say anything on Twitter and lose your job for it. Like the First Amendment doesn't protect you from saying dumb shit and not having, you know, public repercussions on it. But like, if you just understand there to be like some abstract right to free speech for most people and for powerful people, and the cancel culture thing to me and like the hysteria that came thereafter was just this realization that like, oh fuck, it is not only the state that could abridge these artificial rights. Like normal people can band together and like curtail the rights of the very powerful people. And that to me was like, I was like, that's cool. And that's interesting. And that's maybe something to learn from and like to really organize around instead of just like, you know, doing, you know, I don't know, canceling whomever. But that was also what I thought about when you were asking that.
Yeah, and we have a question from Audrey as well.
More of a comment, you know, I listened to that about how they start violating your rights all the more once there's a law that protects you supposedly. And I think about all that Stop LAPD spying has taught me over the years about not codifying policies that end up just legitimizing the policy. And I think about all these laws that are based on like constitutional factors, maybe instead of human and civil rights. And they have loopholes, they have all sorts of things that only, and so, you know, in effect, they're just basically giving, you know, the systemic institutions of power just a reason, you know, a way to violate your rights further, because they can always point to how they protected you, you know, and it's a farce.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing that it's bringing up for me is that there's all of these other things influencing somebody's access to a right besides what's written on paper. And one of it is one of them is like economics. Like, I guess technically any journalist can be, you know, speaking up about, for example, the genocide in Yemen by the Saudi government. But people have they have an idea, oh, if I say this, I might not be able to be promoted, or, you know, there's this like set of economic motivators for people to say the right thing or not say the wrong thing too. And even though it's your quote unquote right, it's like, if it's not an economic right, it's not a political right either, you know? But we have another question down, Nadia, if you want to jump into.
Yeah, thank you. Before I do, does anybody else want to share? You're welcome to raise your hand, put in the chat. Just wanted to pause and see. Okay, see, Xochitl, it's also hard to say things when you're youth commissioner. Yeah, I'm not sure. When you say youth commissioner, I'm wondering what you mean by that, or if somebody could share, if you would like to share.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so I was really feeling the conversation, like, as a youth commissioner directly impacted, I've been very, very thankful that, I'm able to kind of regain and reclaim my power as a young person. I'm 22 years old, and it's really hard sometimes, like, saying how I feel as a youth commissioner, because sometimes it's like, how you kind of have to play your cards right. Because I'm also part of like a coalition that's working on reimagining the juvenile justice table, juvenile justice system. So it's really hard to kind of be a community member, and then when you're like sitting on these tables in these county meetings, like, you want to say how you really feel, but then you have to be diplomatic, because what you say might like backfire on you. So I just wanted to kind of put like my 2 cents out there, where it's like, when there's like youth tables or youth advisory councils or youth commissioner positions, like, as a young person, we're very pressured on how to play our different hats, or like even like presentation, like, hi, my name is Xochilarios, I'm from Courage, but then I'm also youth commissioner, so it's kind of like, oh, she has like a vote on this table, but then at the end of the day, it might be, they try to say like it's compromising or a conflict, because she's also part of the community, so it's kind of like, how do you sustain and maintain that power? And sometimes I'm always trying to like read like the law, like on how juvenile justice delinquency prevention commissions were developed across the state, and kind of like follow like what it was said, like on why they implemented youth commissioner positions. So, but then it's like, how can you like defend yourself knowing that you know the law, but then they try to like downgrade you and say like, oh, you can't come in no more because your event was too radical, like, I just want to say that, that's what I'd be going through sometimes.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, right? I think navigating that space and knowing just the way kind of a lot of bodies and commissions can serve as these rubber stamps as well. But yeah, I'll just actually pause there. I see Hamid has their hand up. Go for it. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, I was just going to quickly say that with all the hoopla about the Supreme Court decision in New York, I mean, I don't even know what the hoopla is all about. About a few days ago, the state of New York passed a law that all gun applicants will have to share their social media accounts for review. So there we go. I mean, so I think it kind of just kind of building on Audrey's point as well, that whenever we are thinking of policy and policy changes and, you know, just making demands, it's, you know, there are always a huge price to pay. And that's where, you know, for us, it's not really, this whole reform bullshit is exactly what it is, that you cannot reform a system that is so rotten to the core. And I just quickly also want to add to a couple of things that Dami was raising as well around gun control. And I'm glad that, you know, that we are having this conversation, because, you know, any kind of control will have to come later, but in what landscape are we even asking for these kind of laws as well? I mean, as far as white supremacy, and for the longest time, and of course we talk about that, I believe May 2nd, 1967 on the Sacramento Capitol lawn, as Ronald Reagan was having his press conference, and here comes the Panthers marching down. And it's I don't know if folks have ever seen that video. It's probably one of the most telling videos, where Ronald Reagan, who just loved the camera and who couldn't believe that all of a sudden the camera just literally moved from him, and all the cameras, they show the cameras moved towards the Panthers. So it wasn't just about, you know, gun control. It was like no shit, like they're going to take a bigger camera time than I am, me, the C-grade actor from Hollywood. So I think it's also in all of these cultural, this is no coincidence in these cultural contexts as well, that guns and weapons of, literally weapons of mass destruction, whether this was the colonizers that killed over 100 million native people in the Americas, or whatever tool was, this is their, you know, just God-given divine ornament that they carry. So the idea, so I totally like even trying to understand that this whole anger about gun control is to be expected, and this whole opposition, because it's a white man's ornament and natural, you know, just almost like you would wear something and to carry it, because it's always been an open hunting season on the other. So, you know, and it's not even to protect somebody, it's to proactively engage and hunt people down. So that's always been like that. You're just like, you know, so I think here we are in 2022. So these things should be expected. That's why these gun control laws would always be a much more bigger liability on non-white communities than anybody else. So just wanted to throw that in there.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. That actually, we have one more question that kind of, I feel like, partially answers it. And then we're actually going to go into a discussion as well, just around what does an abolitionist approach look like, right? To shootings and everything, and gun violence. But Hamid, you kind of touched on it a little bit, but Dami, if you want to build on that a little, right? So then, knowing that the state is a white supremacist system, right? So then, and this might feel like an obvious question, but definitely would like to hear your thoughts, and anyone else's as well. Where does then, you know, the state violence and police violence fit in to this conversation around gun control?
Yeah, and I really appreciate those points. And, you know, I was just thinking about, like, if you think about the Second Amendment and when it was passed, you know, after, you know, what they call the Revolutionary War or the War for Independence, it's like, okay, so why do y'all free people need guns now? And it's like, oh yeah, because, you know, there's these Native Americans and these Black folks that need to be policed, right? Like, and so that's, you know, that's really just the real origin of gun control. It wasn't to hunt people, and it wasn't to fight against the British. It was like to police people whom we brought here to be our slaves, and to like go kill and dispossess people of their lands. And that's the real origin. I think to answer your question, and this is not just kind of, you know, the people who are like most, I guess, anti gun or, like kind of like, your prototypical like liberal, like, anti-gun person is like the people who really believe that the state is going to kill them to protect them. And like want a society in which only the police have guns and no one else has guns. You know, that I think that's the view of some. Like some would want that kind of state, and like the person that wants that kind of state is the person that really feels comfortable and powerful in the state and feels protected by the state. And because like most of us aren't in that situation, like I think we need to take a different view on guns and gun control, or maybe instinctively just take a different view of guns and gun controls. Like I don't know if we're in the posture where like an armed revolution is anything that's like in the foreseeable future, but like I think we deeply, especially in this call, know that like the state is not there to protect us, and the state is not there to protect our people, and the state is not there to protect our communities. And so like we just aren't just as reliant, or instinctively just aren't as reliant on the state, and we cannot be okay with the condition that like, oh, the police in the state have guns and nobody else has guns. And that, and I'm not into the I'm not into the policy stuff generally. And I don't even know if perhaps there should be an abolitionist lens. I mean, there should be, and we should be thinking about like how to engage people who's talking about gun controls and who like are seriously like really scared that like the proliferation of guns in society are problematic. We should be engaging them, but I think I just don't, on a personal level, like a gun control debate or gun control policy is just like not something that like I think, our attention should be really focused on.
Just a quick clarifying question, Dami, is that in terms of both for and against gun control, like we should just completely side or reserve our energy for other topics or fights that are more relevant to our goals? Or do you mean specifically in one of the directions?
No, I think that we should, wherever possible, be against laws or regulations that could lead to people being incarcerated, and that could like increase the power of the state to punitively punish people. So we should always be in favor of laws that like reduce punishment, or at least that's where I come from. But I just mean like insofar as like you take somewhat seriously kind of the argument that AR-15 shouldn't be on the street. And then there's like a debate about that. Like I actually, yeah, people probably shouldn't have AR-15s. I admit that. Like, yeah, those things aren't like cool. They are used to hunt people. And like, I don't think like normal everyday people are carrying AR-15s, or that's what kind of people, I'm understanding people to be wanting like for protection for themselves and their family and from the state. I just mean in like these debates that usually happen at the like federal, congressional level about like what kind of guns, because that's the question. It's not like they're saying like we're going to get rid of guns. There's no handgun ban ever coming, right? Like, and there is no rifle ban, there is no shotgun ban. There may be just some ban, and it may not even be constitutional to ban some kind of assault style rifle or some kind of assault style weapon. And I just kind of mean like in those debates, I just don't really, take a position, because I just don't think it moves the ball very much.
Yeah, no, thank you for lifting that, right? And I feel like that's something, I know a few of us have just been having those conversations, right? Like this, like it shouldn't even be a debate, because we know, right? We know the origins of the state and who the state is. So no, thank you for lifting that. And so I think, I think for us, like part of the reason of bringing this conversation was because, and we're going to get into that in a little bit, right, is how then these issues and these topics then, as we know, get used to create. So for example, right, we see now these phrases around violent extremism and terrorism being more and more used very actively, as you're saying, Dami, right, on the federal level. And they've been being used now for like 30 plus years, but they're really hitting it hard now. And so that's kind of why one reason we wanted to bring this conversation here. And and go ahead and yeah, and we want to kind of open it up for discussion, you know, and just see what folks think, right? You know, just share your general thoughts about this, or, you know, some other questions we were thinking too, right? Or what are some of the roots of these mass shootings, these school shootings, right? So what are abolition approaches? Should there even be an approach, right? And I think Dami raised a question, should these conversations, maybe not necessarily our conversation, but should these even be happening at those levels, right? So I'll go ahead and type that in the chat, and yeah, and Dami, of course, feel free to hang out with us as we do this conversation if you're able to. But yeah, thank you so much for being here and for talking about this with us. So yeah, I'll actually pause there, and I don't know if Dami, anything you wanted to share, and I'll go ahead and type some of those questions in the chat as well for discussion.
I'm going to stay for a bit, but the only thing I'll add is I think the one good thing for me about this conversation is I think I had fallen into the trap of thinking that, like, oh, yeah, guns are like bad. Like, you know, maybe when I was in college or law school, you asked me 10 years ago, I'd be like, yeah, guns probably should be banned. And I, on a personal level, and I think Black folks generally, and, you know, Black gun ownership is going up, is that, like, I think, you know, I also think it's always a good thing to, like, kind of understand and clarify that, like, we need to be completely less reliant on the state, and that, like, we should be by ourselves in these discussions talking about, like, how do we protect ourselves and each other in our communities. And I think that, like, you know, given what Hamid said and what we know about, like, gun ownerships, and gun ownership will always be, like, you know, the ornament or the God-given right of, like, white folks and the police and the state. I think that's just made me over the last few years realize that, like, oh, you probably should think about getting a gun, right? Like you can't just have this kind of, like, you know, liberal, like, oh, I don't want guns are bad, guns kill people, but, like, oh, we need to think about protecting ourselves and protecting our people. And maybe my question for folks is, like, do you think that, like, requires us to carry guns? It's not even like this argument about, like, gun control, but, like, do we then have, like, are we required, is there some mandate for us to carry guns and think about protecting ourselves and our families and our communities?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Dami, for sharing that. And yeah, and so I think just want to open it up to folks too, if folks even have questions or thoughts, right? I think some of the questions I put in there, it's just a few discussion questions, just to get you thinking, get you sharing. And then also the last question I was going to add too was, which was something we've been looking at, right? What are folks' thoughts around, right? How, you know, on one hand we have, I think I forgot how you phrased it, but right, this sort of right wings, like a celebration, white supremacist celebration of guns, and then on the other hand, that we have liberal folks criminalizing and criticizing folks for using guns in uprisings. And so, so how do we navigate, and just thoughts around that as well. So yeah, I'll just pause there and see if anyone wants to share in the chat, or raise your hand, or I think you even may be able to unmute. I believe so. Do folks maybe have any questions or anything? I know it's a lot of things to think about and discuss.
I have a
And
question.
even if you've already talked, you're welcome to share.
I have a question for Celine, if you're free and available. Are you there? Okay, maybe not. Oh, yeah. Could I say it out loud, and then could I read out loud your answer if you can only type it in the chat? Okay, so part of my wondering about this is if people's thoughts on guns and the state's role in regulating them is in part kind of like influenced by our being propagandized throughout our whole life to view this state as natural and normal, and having to like work on unlearning that, and therefore sort of seeing, so what Dami was saying about the liberals' dream of nobody having guns except for the police. And I'm just wondering, as far as I know in Palestine, because Celine is also a part of PYM, one of the main people from PYM. As far as I know, there's murals celebrating heroes of resistance and people who've used arms to resist. And it seems like there's less identification with the state of Israel, in the sense that, there's a celebration of political prisoners, there's an official day for it. There's, when you've been there, do you feel like the idea of armed resistance and the approach to guns among a population that views its occupiers as more unnatural maybe just because the propaganda hasn't been as effective? Do you think that there's a difference culturally in how people see guns? Or maybe Israel hasn't even tried to convince Palestinians that it's their state at all,
Mm.
Does that include Palestinians in 48? So Selena's saying, I think it comes down to the difference in how people see the state.
Mm.
Sorry, Celine, maybe I should have asked you when you were recovered from your sickness.
Maybe too, as Celine is, oh, there we go. Go ahead.
So Celine says, it depends, but I think broadly people support the right of resistance, and regardless of whether that is supported in general, I think it's the position we need to normalize. Thank you, Celine.
Yeah, thank you. And then I got a question sent here asking, I have a question more directed toward the hyper-surveillance policing culture supported by the state and law, but I'm not sure how to phrase it. Just wondering how we can stop doing that to each other, the propaganda, etc. So I just want to see how can we just abolish the state? Sorry, I'm trying to form words around this feeling. No, I think those are, yeah, so just to kind of repeat it, it seems like this person is basically looking at, yeah, how do we abolish, right, hyper-surveillance and policing culture? And yeah, no, thank you for expressing that. And I'll go ahead and put it out there to folks if folks just have thoughts. I know my kind of thinking around that is, I think it's, right, it starts with ourselves. How do we, right, there's the phrase, kill the pig in your head, right? And so how do we kind of think of that? How do we police ourselves? How do we police each other? And how do we sometimes carry out the oppression we experience from the state or from other folks? But yeah, thank you for posing that question. So I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts they want to share around that, right? Around, right, just stopping this hyper surveillance policing culture. Anyone else have any thoughts around that?
Just I guess I'm not sure who asked, but I think it would offer me a little more clarity if maybe I had an example of what the person was thinking of regarding hyper-surveillance policing culture, like just even amongst ourselves, or like what aspect.
It also says, right, like hyper surveillance policing culture supported by the state and the law. Not necessarily a specific example, but I think that's kind of what they were looking at.
I mean, I think just off jump, it kind of, I'm really piggybacking off what Celine said, but I think it comes down to the difference in how people see the state. And, I think the more people kind of realize that the state has an adversarial relationship with you, that policing and, that complicity to policing and surveillance will kind of diminish. So I think the easiest, I guess it's kind of a cop-out answer, but it's to kind of know the fight, like know your fight, as we always say. Yeah, first and foremost, just know the state's not your friend. Show people that the state's not their friend. I think there are plenty of examples.
Yeah, and just to add to what Matheus is saying, I think like the one thing that comes in mind as well is like being able to like question all forms of authority, whether it's in your like family relationships or in like whether it's like a parent figure, whether it's a like a lawmaker, whether it's like an elder. I think being able to question that, especially to question about like if you like what that abusive relationship is with the state, and how like certain policies, right, are kind of seen as a response to some form of to address some form of community harm allegedly, right? But we know how like how these policies and how these laws work. It's also through selective enforcement, and even in just thinking like when they tell us like officer involved shooting, like those are forms that they are able to justify, like we don't really talk about the levels of like state sponsored and how like police like are constantly shooting, killing and targeting folks in the community. And so being able to kind of see that like in our everyday lives, I think is a challenge to both learn and unlearn, but to be able to like also continue to have those, call out those discrepancies, because they give us one thing, give us sound bites and tell us it's in response to something that our community needs, but we know the reality of it is a lot different.
Yeah, thank you, Matiosini. And a follow-up question they put was, I guess I'm wondering how to bring these ideologies into spaces where it may not be safe to, right? So ideologies of being neighbors to your neighbors, not ratting on community members, basically not relying on the police to help us. So this person is saying how to bring these ideologies into spaces where it may not be safe to. And if folks have any thoughts on that, and if you've already shared, feel free to continue sharing. Thank you for posing that question.
I just want to add to that question in the sense that I feel like I know people in my family or in my life who, if I expressed the beliefs that we're talking about in this call, they would think I'm like disrespectful to the victims of school shootings, you know? And I wonder if, because it's almost like for liberalism, which is really pervasive, even if they recognize the problems with their trust in the police, for example, I feel like there's something very there's something preventing them from completely abandoning it, you know? And then yeah, it feels like they would think that I'm like cavalier about those deaths. So I don't have an answer either, but I would love to hear from if other people have approached conversations like that too. I guess that's not feeling unsafe. So it's minimizing like the person who actually did feel unsafe, but yeah, sorry about that.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, this is a really important issue that was raised. I see a few hands up. We'll go with Comrade. We haven't heard from you, and then I saw Hamid and then Matios.
You're muted.
You're on mute. Yes.
Hey, can you hear me now?
What's up?
Hello. Good. All right. Yeah. Just to touch on that, I think that liberals are going to get caught slipping on the gun argument, the liberal side of it itself, because I think the right is showing us that they're reactionary enough and extreme enough, and even these school shootings themselves are an aspect of the violence through guns that they're trying to enact on the population. I mean, the right is well organized, and they're showing the world that, not even the world, but I mean just like liberals in general and the country, that they're ready to use violence and they're ready to use guns. And I think that anyone who can get a gun, you know, who isn't a felon and who is, of course, you know, feels mentally prepared and comfortable enough to do so, or even training, I think it's a great proactive thing to do at this point, because I don't think we should be carrying them perhaps in the streets. I think that invites more police violence in and of itself. But I think having a gun and is proactive in the country's slip and descent into fascism itself. So I think we should try to push back against the liberal arguments against it, and then also, you know, try and strengthen and formulate our analysis around combating, you know, the kind of liberalism that would have us afraid of guns and unarmed when the right does start to expand the violence that they're enacting on people. So yeah, that's my piece on that.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, Comrade. I appreciate that. And then we had a Hamid and then Matios.
I will wait for Matios. Please go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Ahmed. I'll keep it brief. I was just thinking about what Akil said, and about how I've kind of, you know, brought my views into spaces where they weren't necessarily accepted. And one example I keep kind of coming to over the years is my dad, who's, you know, an older African immigrant. So, and, you know, who's been in this country for a long time. So I think, like most folks, well, you know, him having experienced, like, you know, political violence back home, that's kind of shaped his perception of things too, and like his grasp on peace. But like I don't have a good answer, but I feel like it's nuanced and different for everybody. But what's worked for me is just, one, the agitational aspect of just consistently chiming in a very loving way about certain points, and then two, just even kind of embodying, like in a not like holier than thou way, but just even like, you know, just moving with that, like, you know, I don't snitch, I don't, you know, I don't police, I don't necessarily, you know, judge in whatever capacity or metric it is. And so that's kind of what's been working for me. And I think over time, like, I find with most of the things we're kind of talking about, you know, it's not based on reinforcing a narrative of any sort. If anything, you know, what we're saying is reinforcing a reality. And so, like, occurrences in the world are going to reinforce the way we move and what we say and kind of the ideologies we're pushing. And so I think that works in our favor. And I think that's reflected in the fact that, you know, there was such a big, you know, abolition got sexy in 2020, you know what I mean? So And I think that speaks to the fact that reality is going to further reinforce what we have to say, I guess is all that I'm saying. So persistence is really all I can push.
Nice, thank you, Matheus.
Thank you all. Really good conversations. I think for that, for the question that is being raised, I mean, that is a big question, and this is what the Stop LAPD Spying has built its own narrative and its work around that very question as well. And because surveillance is a lived experience. It's not a scheduled event. It's not something that is, and we, if we would look back, I mean, many times we talk about surveillance as if the concept and the practice of surveillance is only limited to the state. The state has built that and codified it and more formalized that practice based on relationship building and on social control and power dynamics and who has the power and who wants to keep an eye on the other. So in a sense, we learn and we experience that even in our families and interpersonal relationships and in school and at work and you know, just everywhere else. But I think it really depends as to what is it for. I mean, like fundamentally just keeping an eye on you is either I'm watching your back or I'm exposing your back, you know, or I'm gathering information to trash you, or I'm gathering information to really, in a sense, to get to know you better, where, you know, there could be more solidarity. And so I think these are all sort of very fluid and dynamic, you know, both relationships and all of that. But I'm reminded of some of we started this whole, you know, conversation, and we had 3 or 4 community conversations, very powerful conversations at the Southern California Library around embodied abolition. And this was exactly the stuff that we would lift in that embodied abolition about, like, you know, how do we speak to each other? How do we talk to each other? And it's a vast area. I mean, I think I can only, and I think I'm not here to give an answer, but kind of share the experience and how that can relate to what the question is. Going back to even the coalitions starting up, very basic formation of the coalition was not like people coming in and telling somebody that this is what surveillance is and this is what we need to do. It was spending time, 8 to 9 months, to talking to different groups, to individuals on the street, whether it was trans folks, whether it was undocumented youth, whether it was young people coming out of cages, whether it was the unhoused community, whether it was day laborers, that what does surveillance even mean to us? What does it mean to you? And I think what that did was it helped us and checked our own vocabulary. It checked our own sort of understanding. And from there, we started the conversation. And I think the other piece I just want to throw it is that we you know, a lot of times surveillance is seen, at least now, as if like it's on the license plate readers or these material side of things. But, you know, the culture, and when you look at the state, before any of these tools, it was a culture of deputization has always been there, like, you know, just on behalf of, which has taken various shapes and things as well. So I think it's always to start that conversation, at least what I have learned in building with the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition and before in organizing as well, that it needs to be really personalized. It needs to be really humanized. It really needs to be, and we need to the start of the conversation needs to be not on a structural level, but really from a human level, that what is the impact? What is the harm and the injury and the emotional trauma that these things cause? How, you know, just, and even, and I'm going to be the first one to be very blunt about it. Our social justice movement is a huge fucking gossip column. Like, you know, I mean, people just don't talk to each other in front of their faces, but there's so much kind of just back the conversation going on. I mean, who's doing whom, who's doing what, whatever that person is this, that person is that. So I think that is very harmful to our movement buildings as well. So I think we talk about snitches and informants, but, you know, I mean, they are experienced on so many different levels as well. So I think going back to it, you know, just kind of having almost like a reality check ourselves and collectively that how much harm these things have done. And I mean, I've seen in my family, like elders, I mean, an aunt was known to be the biggest gossip columnist, and she was my mom's younger sister, and my mom would just go at her like, you know, the UF and so, you're gonna make somebody vulnerable, somebody's gonna get killed. Because, so I think these are the things that we need to sort of like constantly, that they're not separate from this broader culture of policing each other and policing ourselves as well. So not a structured sort of a canned answer or even an answer at all, but just kind of just sharing through our own experiences. How do we bring it to the rest of our communities? Thank you. Hope that made sense.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for raising that. I really appreciate kind of those, right, like those reminders of how really bringing it home as much as possible in that sense. No, and thank you for folks who've shared so far. Before we do go on to the next part, I think this is a great conversation. Does anyone else want to share, either addressing this question that was posed, right, about how to kind of get at these ideas, these ideologies in spaces where it may not be as safe or acceptable, or any other comments or questions before we move forward? Yes, I see EP, go for it.
Yeah. So I'm gonna try to talk. I'm also recovering from COVID. You know what tends to work for me in spaces like, I guess, the ones that are being discussed in this chat, is sometimes people, and I think somebody else sort of touched on this, already know these things are happening. It's just they need to be reminded about the George Floyd uprisings, about the history of this country and things of that nature. And when you kind of give people the kind of a quick kind of rundown as to why you feel the way you feel about the state and the system, and you kind of go through a sort of, again, quick synopsis of its history and what it's founded upon, and also recent developments, I think a lot of people tend to, you know, the ones that actually are, you know, not married to the state, get activated, and they usually, I feel, you know, go along with what's being said. It just sometimes you have to, at least I tend to remind myself that, you know, people, you know, that are not in our spaces often, you know, are listening to mainstream media sources and a lot of neoliberals. And so you kind of get in like a trance when you're around these people for a majority of your days and time. But when you remind people about all this, you know, they tend to be more on board. You know, even the sort of liberal folks who watch CNN and MSNBC and shit like that, when you interact with them and you have these conversations, this kind of deep canvassing with them, feel like you kind of snap them out of that trance. So that's something that has worked for me, that I wanted to share with y'all.
Yes, thank you, EP, for sharing that. Really appreciate you lifting that. And yeah, I see Brother Pancake also put connect with neighbors with goal of building community, be creative, use different mediums, platforms to reach folk in our communities. Having conversations are so important. What do we say to data-driven policing? Shut it down. One love, Pancake. Thank you for always reminding us of that. Yes, thank you, EP. Thank you, Brother Pancake, so much for sharing that. And yeah, and thank you to the person who raised this question. I think these are really, really important questions that none of us have an answer to, but we should be thinking about. Yeah, so any other thoughts around this? Happy to keep hearing them. Go for it if anybody would like to share.
Can I just,
Cool.
oh,
Oh,
so-
Akil, I saw you on mute. Go for it.
just thought of something. There's this section from Wretched of the Earth where they're like talking about the French's decision to arm civilians, European civilians in Algeria. And can I read it out loud? It's just a couple of sentences, and it's really like talks about who they want to have guns and how. So this is from like an Algerian newspaper talking about the horrible decision, but it says, so the UN says enough bloodshed, and then so let us form militias, replies Lacoste. What do you say? Lacoste decrees that henceforth every European shall be armed and should fire on anybody appearing suspect. The savage, iniquitous repression bordering on genocide must above all things be combated by the authorities, was the general opinion. Lacoste retorts, let us systemize the repression, let us organize a manhunt of Algerians. And symbolically, he hands over civilian power to the military and military power to the civilians. And then later he says, in 48 hours, 2,000 candidates were enrolled. The Europeans of Algeria immediately responded to Lacoste's call for murder. From now on, every European will have to make a list of the surviving Algerians in his sector, gathering intelligence, rapid response to terrorism, identifying suspects, elimination of runaways, and police reinforcements. Yes, the army must be alleviated of such jobs. Just reminding me of Dami talking about why they, in getting the people guns at the very beginning of the country,
Yeah, thank you for reading that, Akil. I think that really captures it. And then I see also EP added, even the libs love the founding fathers who won their war using guns and with militias. Also, who doesn't love Star Wars, who were armed revolutionaries, right? I always say FFF, fuck the founding fathers. Thank you for sharing that, EP. Any other thoughts or things to read out? All right, cool. And then, and I also see, yes, I was requested to also read the very important comment by Hamid. Thank you for that. It wasn't Hamid who requested, somebody else requested that, just to clarify.
Sorry for that, it wasn't meant for everyone. So yeah, my bad.
All right, so speaking of not snitching, I won't say who asked me to read that. All right, anyways, I think we'll go ahead and transition then. And if folks have anything that you want to share or have a question, please feel free to go ahead and put it in the chat. I'll go ahead and pass it on then to Matios and Akil, who will be giving us a quick update about what happened at City Hall. And then after that, we'll close with me with the community policing and counterinsurgency. Go for it.
Yeah, thanks so much, Nadia. Hey, folks, my name is Matthias. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the person that asked Nadia to read Hamid's comment out loud. So what we're talking about is on June 1st, a few of us went to the city council meeting where they were talking about allocating an additional $100,000 from this Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention Grant, TVTP, to the LAPD, providing alternatives to Hinder Extremism program. And a little bit of background on this grant. So the War on Youth group kind of spotted that this grant was awarded to the LAPD last fall. And in the winter, the Board of Police Commissioners kind of passed this $250,000 grant, approved this $250,000 grant to the LAPD. And so TVTP, for folks that don't know, is a Department of Homeland Security grant. It's just a rebranding of a grant that folks might have heard of called Countering Violent Extremism. And it's used to to implement counter extremism programs through surveillance of youth in different parts of the country. And so here in LA, yeah, it's being used to support this LAPD program called Providing Alternatives to Hinder Extremism, which would take 500 educators, counselors, therapists, and train them to look for risk factors for extremism in youth. And so, you know, when this passed, the Board of Police Commissioners, we started organizing immediately, just mobilizing different groups, creating POP-Ed to make sure this didn't pass City Council. You know, a lot of the folks on this call, and I'm so sorry, another bit of background. So the CVE grant was actually here in LA before in 2018, and folks like Nadia and Nikhil and a bunch of educators organized against it and, you know, got it out under the name of CVE. They pushed it out of LA. And so, you know, we did a similar strategy this time around where we got a bunch of organizations to sign a letter saying we don't want it. This included UTLA, the LA USD Teachers Union, included Black Lives Matter Los Angeles, Students Deserve, the International Indigenous Youth Council, over 40 orgs, PYM obviously, who runs a War on Youth group in partnership with us. And so we got all these people, we got thousands of emails sent to City Council saying we don't want it. And it still passed. It still passed. And so they had, I guess it was an initial allocation in that first meeting. And this meeting was just pumping in another 100,000 from that grant for the LAPD PATHE program. And Akhil, maybe you want to talk a little more about the meeting.
Yeah, it was really interesting because the first meeting, the one where it passed City Council, it got to be heard, meaning we got to give lots of public comments almost unanimously against it. There was one person who spoke out in favor. I think they made time for 17 comments against it. And that was in addition to the unanimous online comments, which we've gotten from public records requests. So every single comment that we've found that went to them was against it, except for that one person who spoke at that first meeting. And 2 council members voted no. It was Nithya Raman and Mike Bonin. Mike Bonin, it was clear he had read up on it and was very solidly no. He spoke out for a while and pretty passionately. I'm not excusing everything he's done in his career, but I'm saying in this one thing, he spoke out pretty passionately against PATHE and advised other council members to vote no. Nithya Raman also spoke, but it was kind of wishy-washy, but eventually voted no. At this most recent meeting, which was the 100,000, Nithya Raman wasn't there. She was absent. But if you blinked, you would have missed it. It was up on the screen for a second. Mike Bonin, actually, it wouldn't have even gone on the screen except for the fact that Mike Bonin asked for a separate vote for it, because otherwise it would have been voted in addition to all the other consent agenda items in just one fell swoop, approved. Mike Bonin asked for another vote and he voted no. Everybody else who was present voted yes, and it got passed. No discussion, and by the way, that was before the public comments. So they did the public comments afterwards, and it was also the same meeting that they were hearing about an amendment to 4118 that would further criminalize more and more places in LA, this time under the idea of protecting youth by banning unhoused people from places around schools and daycares. And it seemed very much, and I think other people who were there probably agree with this, that Nuri Martinez was like combing through and deciding who got to speak. You don't agree, Matius?
No, I absolutely do.
Oh, yeah.
Say to the extent where we saw Nuri,
Yeah,
scrolling through names as
yeah, and calling the same people twice, and they'd have to tell her we already spoke multiple times. So eventually, you know, she did call some people who were against that amendment, and when we left, because they were voting on that amendment after the public comment, they voted on PATHE beforehand. When we left, it was after multiple city council members made extremely disgusting comments, about why they support this bill. And it was just very ironic because in the same meeting that they were talking about protecting youth from unhoused people, how many youth have been killed by unhoused people in LA compared to how many youth have been killed by the police, they were giving $100,000 more to the police to stalk, target, harass youth. And we know that it's constant harassment, sexual harassment, racial profiling, targeting, bullying, beating, and murdering that's happening of the youth by the police, with the same people that the city council wants to now, to continue to like brutalize unhoused people. So it was a very, it was really, anyway, I can stop venting. Thank you for sharing that, Matias. Yeah.
Yeah, and so it should also be said that they clearly had like the deck stacked. Thanks, Dami. Have a great night. Thanks so much for plugging in. Yeah, they had the deck stacked with parents who were kind of sharing experiences of like fear with like unhoused people. But in addition to that, there were also Black mothers with their children who talked about being unhoused, and no one made mention of how the expansion of 4118 to include 500 feet within schools would affect them, so that was just it clearly highlighted their intent. And that it should also be noted that there were a lot of people there was a building manager who came up and spoke in support, who I'm very skeptical had the best interest of children in his heart, when he went up there. And, so it's just really telling. But we're continuing to fight back against that. We put in some PRA requests to learn more about the PATHE. Yeah, with the garbage fedora, yes. To learn more about the PATHE program. And we want to encourage folks to come to our working group meeting next week, so we can fight back. If folks have any questions, feel free to.
Is there a possibility, real quickly, Akhil or Matios, I know Shakir's not here, because people may want to know, because we had filed a lawsuit against Koretz on public records. So it may not be a bad idea to maybe give a quick snapshot as to where things are at with that.
Sure, yeah. I actually was just opening it up, but they gave us a whole new bundle of files I think it's around like 1.5 gigabytes of files. So I think it's our job to now look through that and decide whether or not we want to, keep pushing. But yeah, sorry, let me give a background too for people who may have missed it. The reason that we filed this lawsuit is because so the Simon Wiesenthal Center, which runs the Museum of Tolerance, is one of the nonprofits that coordinates closely with the state to do programs that supposedly combat extremism. And in 2018, the same year that we successfully pushed the city to block a CVE grant, the state of California awarded a preventing violent extremism grant to the Simon Wiesenthal Center to institute programming for preventing violent extremism in LA schools, even though the United Teachers of Los Angeles had written a motion against both CVE and PVE. And in their grant application, they had a letter of endorsement from Paul Koretz, who it seems from their many press releases throughout the years, they often mention Paul Koretz is one of their close allies within city council. So we had submitted a records request asking for the extent of their communications between Paul Koretz's office and Simon Wiesenthal Center to try to find out more about how this endorsement letter came about and ultimately how this grant was awarded to them. And also to find out more about the grant itself and what was done under the framework of preventing violent extremism. So now with that background, Matios, do you want to talk about like the way they ignored it and the lawsuit and stuff like that?
Yeah, I think that's you've kind of said it all.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's good. Yeah, so we sued them. And yeah, so we've gotten documents back. And we want people to plug in and look through them. And I'll even plug a really great IG post we have that kind of goes over this a little bit more. So I'll find that and I'll plug it into the chat. But if folks have any questions about the TVTP program, the PATHE program, what it's going to look like in our schools, what schools it's going to be implemented in, some background about it.
And,
I think you're I'm just grateful it's not a Zoom bomber personally. Cool. Yeah, I think that's all we got, Nadia.
Nice, thank you both. I appreciate y'all providing that update and all good. I guess we have had 2 little Zoom slip-ups today. Nice. Always good to break it up with that a little. Zoom slip-ups, right now, Zoom bombs, like you said. But anyways, I'll go ahead and pass it on to you, Nee. I know we don't have as too much time left, but I know you have definitely some really important stuff to share, so go for it.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. My name is Nee. I use she, they pronouns with the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about, we'll get into the zine and some of the pop-it material that we're kind of, that grew out of our community policing working group. And just talking about like counterinsurgency and community policing, specifically looking at the 3 uprisings that we saw here in so-called LA, including the Watts uprising, the Watts, Rodney King, and George Floyd uprisings. So we're looking at those 3 specific examples as a case study to look at the efforts of reform, right, that the state tends to introduce in response to community giving or providing their grievances and talking about things that they continue to face every single day. And so I wanted to maybe just touch base on like how counterinsurgency and community policing are tied to gun reform and other reform efforts. And just to provide some historical, like a framework. So the folks have been talking about TVTP and other like CVE and PATHE programs that specifically are targeting youth through deputizing other agencies, whether it's under TVTP, you see it with counselors, you'll see it with teachers, and you'll see it with clergy folks. As a way of being able to identify and really utilizing and weaponizing the school shooter narrative to justify and to say like, oh, we need to find out who's doing this and be able to predict essentially who's going to be a school shooter. And that's kind of similar as well to January 6th and when you see kind of forms of like white supremacy, how that gets utilized and how like Biden in response under Biden's administration had also categorized different forms of extremism. And in the same vein that they put Black extremism, they put white nationalist in the same way that they put folks that are allegedly, who claim the narrative of pro-life are under the same vein as folks who are pro-choice or advocating or providing that bodily or what that is autonomy. And so how they utilize really these moments of community harm to be able to continue pushing the same tactics that they've continued to utilize in counterinsurgency and community policing. And so it's just expanding the forms of folks targeting folks. And we know that from these programs, what they say these reforms are for is, it looks a lot different on the ground. It looks more like the targeting and the policing and the criminalizing, and folks catching cases, specifically, well, non-white, heteronormative, and through like all these other forms that we see, that are kind of rooted right in the settler colonies, whether it's cis heteropatriarchy, capitalism, all these different forms that kind of that we see in our communities. And then so the zine specifically, it's about our like our relationship with the state, and identifying how we are in an abusive relationship with the state. And I'm going to screen share real quick so just folks can see the the layout. It's still a work in progress. So there are some missing pieces here, but just wanted to show y'all kind of just the kind of that flow that we're going through to talk about, or to make that case about how for a lot of folks it's we're asking not to be killed. We're asking for and I really appreciated also in what Dami had mentioned earlier about like about our rights, and even within that, like I don't even feel like rights is not really the like that term, right? Because if we know from our history, if we know from like Roe versus Wade, if we know from gun reform, how these rights, right, can be at any point taken away. And these are really things that just by virtue of you being here, and being for virtue of you being here, you should be like, there are no questions about whether or not you should be deserving of that, but you are. And so it's kind of looking into that history. So the just real quick, the table of contents, so it looks at the three different moments, like not a moment in time, but the three specific, the Watts, Rodney King, and George Floyd, looking at the ways in which we continue to talk about, or like the myth of the riot, how we continue to look at in like the conversations really being about like whether or not someone's deserving of it, and that looks like victim blaming, and we see that in a number of different ways, but the way in which um, we kind of are able to look at folks that are going through this violence and say, oh well, you're not doing it the way that we're supposed to do it. But if you look at if our history, right, we haven't really gotten our grants, or we haven't really gotten our rights, specifically through just voting, and often really forget about like America loves violence, and until we kind of get to that root, really all of these efforts are always going to be not in the best interest of our communities, and it's going to look a lot different in certain communities. It's going to be selectively enforced, and so we know that kind of that history. And I'll keep just scrolling through, but how like in in the history, right? Like if you look at those three moments, folks were clear about what they wanted. Folks were clear about their demands. Folks were clear about the frustrations about that ongoing violence that we see and that we continue to see every day. In just the last week, there has been three police killings for folks in the community, and again the way in which they're able to justify it, and the way that they are able to kind of paint this narrative of folks, and we know it's a lot more complicated, and we know that it's a lot different than the sound bites that LAPD has, and mind you that LAPD has over 40 folks that they can tap into for PR, for being able to create those sound bites to be able to deflect from what folks are asking, and it's the immediate well, the abolition of policing, but also to also think about like the other creative ways that the state really isn't addressing any of the things that they often are the ones who create. And so it continues to go on, and kind of just focusing as well. So the myth of the riot, how like revitalization plans, counterinsurgency plays a huge role too. The tactics that are created, and then just to name a few, and I'll stop screen sharing right here. So abolish the police, not hire diverse police. So the different reform efforts as well that were passed. Um, and we look at different reform efforts from those three moments in time, whether it's the advisory boards that were created in response to Rodney King, which now even like even I think last month there has been a push for LAPD or a push from LAPD specifically to get another police advisory board specifically on technology, or whether it's the body cameras as well, and how like body cameras haven't stopped police murders, how body cameras have been utilized as a way of LAPD to form their narrative, as a way of them being able to tell their story and to edit a lot of that footage. Or if we even look at this response in Uvalde, there were like all these profiteers as well that profit from this kind of partnership, and how profitable really policing is. And you see like private companies like Axon, formerly known as I believe it's the Taser company or Taser, how Axon at the as like community folks are still grieving and mourning, how they took to kind of pitch an idea for drones with tasers, as a response to one, police not responding in the ways that like are constantly being utilized by, or constantly being painted by the state as reasons why we need them. How they are quick to put out those kind of responses or kind of reform efforts, not because it's gonna address the harm or the violence, but because it's profitable. And that's also part of the reason why like being able to name like and to know your history and to name the all the different collaborators, all the different moving pieces, when it comes to policing, when it comes to the ways in which we kind of just really quickly try to like not really address the harm, but we are trying to like say that we're doing something without addressing the root causes of violence, of the things that are going on in our communities. So yeah, those are kind of some of the reform efforts that we're naming. But even like the way in which they're packaging like officer involved shooting, or how they justify like folks in the community as well, that it was their fault, and that can be seen through a number of different ways. Diversity hires are also ways in which that they're consistently trying to as well, be able to gaslight us into to thinking that like things can be changed, when we know, if we just look at that history, it comes from long lineages of like these efforts that they fail community, but they're doing exactly what they're intended for the police state, and they're continuing to strengthen that as well by telling us and kind of gaslighting us into thinking that they're doing something. So those are kind of just some of the different reform tactics or reform efforts that we've seen as well. And it also just leads us to like the larger conversations about how we deputize other agencies as well. We can see that with a number of different things. We can see it with like neighbors calling the cops on folks in the community. We can see it with like how we police one another, how we police gender and sexuality. And so it's really getting to the cause of, or getting to the root of like autonomy, and being able to both have a collective response, but also to acknowledge that. And especially when you think about like who isn't really granted these rights, and who isn't really like at the table, and like sometimes it takes like it takes creativity, and it takes being able to call that out in any form. So definitely appreciate the person who also talked about like, what does an abolitionist approach look like? What does it look like when you do have differences of opinion? And that's the really frustrating part of those reforms too, because they're constantly changing those names as well, like in Operation Laser being renamed to different programs, and yet still utilizing some of the same tactics, or the gang databases that were ruled unconstitutional, and yet you're still utilizing them through different programs, only calling them now chronic offenders or what have you. But just the ways in which community, or how we deputize other agencies as well. And it comes from as well the See Something, Say Something that I watch, and just other forms of community policing as well, where we are continuing to deputize other folks. So yeah, definitely in thinking about that, it's how do we kill that cop in our head? How do we create and strengthen, have strong communities where police and prisons are obsolete? And so that's something that we're currently continuing to build. But if folks are interested in both having those conversations about what community policing looks like, and how to fight back against both counterinsurgency, reform, and community policing, we are continuing to meet as well to kind of to put out this information as well, to be able to see when you are being gaslit, or when you do see these forms of abuses as well, to be able to better name it and identify it. Yeah. And I'll leave it. If anyone has questions, feel free to put it on the chat or to unmute themselves. And I'll go ahead and unmute. Cool. If we don't have any questions, I would just pass it over to Nadia to wrap us up.
Well, thank you, Ni. Yeah, I really appreciate that presentation, and I've always loved the zine, so thank you for sharing that with us. Yeah, so we're pretty much going to close out, but want to just invite folks again to our working meeting, which is, we have one every month. As I mentioned, it's the space where we basically dive a little deeper into the work, do strategies, create artwork, curriculum, research, talk shit, and so, but yeah, so it's every month, the third Wednesday of every month. So please join us. Feel free to message us or email stoplapdspying@gmail.com. And yeah, and then next Tuesday we have our general meeting. So that will be next Tuesday at 6 p.m. Yeah, does anyone else have any other announcements?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that we'll be doing a workshop at the No Name Book Club this Saturday at 7 p.m. And I encourage folks to register ASAP because it does tend to fill up. And I'll have that flyer up in a little bit, just confirming some final details. But it's going to be a lot of fun. It's going to be interactive. If folks haven't been to the No Name Book Club, it's a great space, lots of great books, a radical library, and they do a lot of work with incarcerated folks. So it's a good place to check out.
Cool, thank you, Matios. Any other announcement from folks?
Yeah, next Tuesday would be our third Tuesday of the month general meeting. We haven't really mapped out stuff. That's pretty much like, just whatever the political landscape is looking like. So just look for that. We should be putting out the word by Friday. Thank you.
Cool, thank
Hi,
you.
Blair Beekman here. Thanks for the meeting. I was a little late today, sorry. I will check out when this meeting can be on YouTube. Thanks. I'm from the San Francisco Bay Area, soon moving to San Diego, and I'm interested in the work you guys are doing. It's really helpful, I think, to a future of how community itself can really better address surveillance and technology needs. Good luck in that effort from all of us throughout California. I quickly wanted to offer the city of Oakland. The reason why I was late, I was kind of studying the Oakland City Council meeting of yesterday. If you want to check it out, they have a whole bunch of items they're working on. They're kind of interesting. I mean, it's nothing too amazing, but progressively speaking, to the future they could possibly be building with the stuff, it's of interest. And just cause ideas with the future of tenants' rights issues. That was the main one. Oh, the future of voting, how the voting can be a more participatory process for the community, and they can get funding, more people based on Seattle ideas. And they want to copy those Seattle ideas. So towards the efforts of a more people can participate in the process and in the candidate process. They can get funding easier. That was of interest. In July, Oakland, I'll conclude here really quickly. In July, Oakland has really interesting agenda items on their council, and this year is no different. And check it out if you can. And just to really mention it, I think it's important to at least be familiar with it with yourselves. Some things didn't pass. They want to give an extra $11 million to the police at this time, which is crazy. And that's the fight of the future of racial equity that we're trying to do so well in Oakland. APTP, Anti-Police Terror Project. They do some really good work on that. We fought really hard and lost in some ways, but thanks for letting me speak. Sorry I'm late, and thanks for the meeting.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that and bringing that here. And yeah, folks are welcome even if they come late. So thank you for that. Any other announcements? All right, cool, y'all. Well, again, feel free to reach out to us, and if not, we'll see you all next Tuesday. Appreciate y'all for joining. Have a good night.
Thank you all. Great meeting. Appreciate it.